Hello, my name is Aviva, and today I'm going to be going through the lowest rated books on Goodreads that I have read. So I actually did not originally come up with this video idea for myself. Haley in Bookland did this a while ago, and I really enjoyed watching her video, so I decided to recreate it. So if you want to check her video out because it was really fun to watch, I'll make sure to have it linked in the description below. But either way, what I'm doing today is basically going through my Goodreads account. I went to goodreads.com, and then I went to my books, then my bookshelf. Under all of my read books, I basically organized it by average rating so that the lowest rated book on Goodreads comes up first. And we're basically just going to go down the list until I get bored of doing this or the video gets too long. So yeah, that is that. So first up, I do have How to Love Your Neighbor by Sophie Sullivan. So this does have an average rating of 3.38, and I did rate it 1 star, and that is actually because I DNF'd it at chapter 5. So I was actually sent this book from the publisher. I think it was like St. Martin Publishing or something. They basically sent it to me so that I could add it to my shelf, show it off, and read and review it if I wanted to. And I ended up getting 5 chapters in, and I really could not wrap my head around the writing. First of all, it was third person, which I do have a hard time reading third person now. I used to not be bothered by that, but now I just have a hard time with it. And then also I just wasn't into the story at all. I know I only got 5 chapters in, but that just shows how bad it is because I'm a really bad at DNFing. So anyway, just the fact that it does have a 3.38 rating makes me feel kind of better that I ended up DNFing it because I probably didn't miss out on much. So yeah, that is the lowest rated book that I have ever read from Goodreads. So next up, we do have 99% of Mine by Sally Thorne, which has an average rating of 3.39, and I gave it a 3 stars. So I remember reading this right after I read The Hating Game, which I absolutely loved at the time that I read it. I think it was probably this time last year or maybe the year before that. I don't even really remember. But basically, I was oh my God, I got to read more of Sally Thorne. So I found this book, and I remember really enjoying it in the moment that I read it. I remember having a really hard time getting into it. The first couple of chapters, I was should I DNF this? I really can't get into it. But then I actually pushed myself through it, and I remember the rest of it being really solid. But then after that, I recommended it to a friend of mine, and she absolutely hated it. I don't know if she DNF'd it or maybe she just really did not see what I saw in it. So I do know that it was an unpopular opinion that I enjoyed the book, but at the time that I read it, honestly, it worked for me. I'm sure I would not like it if I reread it now, but in the moment, it honestly wasn't bad. So 3.39 rating, I'm not surprised to see that because I do know that a lot of people don't like the book, but honestly, it wasn't horrible for me. So yeah, that is that. Anyway, next up, I have A Sweet Mess by J.C. Lee, and this has an average rating of 3.41, and I gave it 4 stars. So I read this, I think this time last year as well, and I remember it being a solid story. So from what I remember, it was basically about this girl who owned a bakery shop or something like that. And one day this critic randomly comes into her bakery just to take a break and have something to eat. And he by mistake ended up getting a cake that wasn't meant for him. It was a cake for a special order birthday party. And he basically ate it and he's what the hell is this bakery? So he ended up writing a really bad review for her, even though she's an amazing baker, and it was just a fluke incident or something like that. So then she ends up really her business ends up tanking because of that, and he feels really bad, but he can't really write an apology review explaining what happened. So he ends up offering her this spot on a cooking show, and then they're gonna end up having to stay in the same house or something like that, and it's forced proximity situation, and whatever, the rest of the story goes wherever it goes. And I just remember in the moment it being a pretty solid story. I will say though that it did end with a trope that I don't like, and I don't know if I could really say it because I'm never sure if this trope is actually a spoiler warning or not, but basically I'm not a fan of a couple of tropes, and one of them was in this book, and I remember that being one of the reasons why I didn't end up giving it 5 stars. And I'm sure that I would not like this book as much now if I read it for the first time, but in the moment it was honestly a solid read minus the ending trope that ended up taking place. So yeah, pretty interesting that it has a really horrible rating because I don't remember it being that bad. But anyway, next up is The Culdesac War by Melissa Ferguson, and this has an average rating of 3.41, and I gave it 3 stars. So I read this back in January of 2021, so a year or so ago, a year and a half ago. I don't know, I'm so bad with math, but anyway, This book is basically some sort of like neighbors, enemies to lovers sort of thing. Like this guy moves in next door to this girl and they just really don't get along because like they're living like very close quarters. Like they don't, there's not a lot of space between their houses and they just end up, stuff happens. I don't really remember too much about it because honestly, it was not the best book in the world. I remember there being like some solid moments in it. Like there was this one funny moment where like they started playing pranks on each other and like they live in a cul-de-sac and like the girl, I think, ended up like putting on Craigslist that this guy is looking to like buy like some like farm animals or something like that. So like one morning his like entire cul-de-sac was like swarmed with farm animals. Like I just remember there being like a lot of pretty funny moments, and honestly like I remember a couple of scenes from this book, but overall I don't really remember it being like a solid story. So I'm not surprised to see that it only has a 3.41 rating, and I gave it a 3 stars. So I feel like I was very on point with that one, even though I read it like a year and a half ago before I was like way pickier, you know, like I wasn't picky back then and yet I still didn't rate it that well. So that's really saying something, you know? Anyway, next up, I have A Totally Awkward Love Story. So this is by Tom Ellen, and this has an average rating of a 3.41, and I gave it 3 stars. And I read this back in November of 2020, so just about 2 years ago or so. But either way, what do I remember about this book? A Totally Awkward Love Story. I'm pretty sure it wasn't set in America. I'm pretty sure it was about like a bunch of like European kids, and I don't really remember a lot of it. I remember like in the moment that I read it, like it was a fine time. Like, you know, it passed the time in the moment that I read it, but it was nothing special. And obviously I forgot almost everything that was about it. So I'm not surprised to see that I ended up giving it 3 stars, and it has a 3.41 rating. So I'm sure that a lot of people felt that way too. So yeah, that is that. Anyway, next up I have Simmer Down by Sarah Smith, which has an average rating of 3.43, and I gave it 3 stars, and I read this back in June of 2020. So yeah, what is that, 2 years ago, June of 2020? That is a long time ago. So is it 2022? It is. So yeah, that has to be 2 years ago. Anyway, I remember not really liking this book. So I feel like if I had read it now, even remembering how I felt about it back then, it probably would have ended up getting like a 2 stars. But back in the day, I didn't really give out a lot of 2-star ratings. So my 3 stars is really like a 2 star. So I'm not surprised that this does have an average rating of 3.43 because it honestly was not that good. What I was upset about this book for was that, first of all, it has such a cute cover, so it was really hard to not like it, but I feel like it was masked in a lot of really good things, but it was just like really weird overall. Like it was this sort of like enemies to lovers food truck thing. This guy ends up like moving in on this girl's like territory where she always parks and tries like stealing her business. So then they end up getting into like, you know, a food war of sorts, and then they're obviously going to be attracted to each other, and then things are going to happen. And I remember there being like such weird scenes. Like it's based in like Hawaii. So at one point she ended up going to this like all nude beach one random morning, and like no one's ever there. And then randomly this guy out of nowhere was there in the water completely nude, and he just like walks out of the water and like she just stares at her, like at him. And it was like, I just remember there being like such weird moments like that, you know? And even at one point, like I'm pretty sure he was like European or something like that. So at one point she ends up going to Europe with him, I think. And like, that's where they like start getting it on or something like that. And I'm just like, why are we in Hawaii randomly going all the way to Europe? Like, I think that like he had something going on, like maybe his mother died or someone was getting married. I don't even really remember, but like basically like there were just weird things in this book, but it was masked by a pretty solid enemies to lovers because there was a lot of good banter. They did have a reason to like not get along and everything like that. So it was a pretty confusing read for me, and I'm not surprised that a lot of people felt that way too. So yeah, Simmer Down by Sarah Smith. Anyway, next up is 10 Rules for Faking It by Sophie Sullivan, and this has an average rating of 3.46, and I gave it 5 stars. And honestly, in the moment that I read it in January of 2021. So a year and a half ago. Again, bad at math. But anyway, I remember really loving this book when I read it. And it's really funny because the first book that I mentioned, How to Love Your Neighbor, was the first book that we talked about here, which was like had an even worse rating. And I actually DNF'd that book. So the thing with this one is that I'm pretty sure I read it before third person bothered me and before I was a very picky reader. So I didn't really see any problems with it in the moment. Like I remember there being like 1 or 2 iffy scenes where I was just like, okay, that was a little bit weird. Like there was one moment where they were like sitting on a couch and like I think she like put her finger in his mouth or he put his finger in her mouth, and I'm just like, that's weird, not sexy. So whatever. Anyway, there were a couple of things that I could remember about it, but overall I remember like thoroughly enjoying the book. So like I'm pretty sure it's like this like bachelorette sort of thing. Like this girl ends up she works for a podcast station, and she ends up walking into work one day while the podcast was live and saying that her boyfriend basically just like cheated on her, and like it could have like really blown up and like gone negative for the podcast station. So they end up deciding to like flip it around, putting her on this new show where it's basically going to be like a bachelorette thing, where the show is going to set her up with a bunch of guys and she's going to try and like go on dates with them, and then like people are going to like vote for like who they think like should win the next round or something like that. Cooper, be quiet please. He's going to now bark, but I'm not stopping. So anyway, that was basically like the gist of it. And then she's going to end up having a romance with like her boss, who is helping her set up this entire situation of sorts. So anyway, I really liked it in the moment. Like I just remember there being like a pretty good amount of like, I don't know, I don't really have any explanation. I liked it. I'm sure that if I read it now, I wouldn't feel the same way. But either way, it is a little bit sad to see that it has such a low rating, because this is definitely one of those ones where I'll be like, oh my God, if I read it now, like what the hell was I thinking giving it 5 stars? But anyway, that is that. So let's move on. Next up, I have The Honey Don't List by Christina Lauren, and this has an average rating of 3.52, and I gave it 5 stars, and I read this back in December of 2020. So very long time ago. I'm not going to blame myself for giving this 5 stars, even though it's probably a pretty not great book because it has an average rating of 3.52. But either way, I remember pretty much enjoying this book when I read it. So you're following these 2 people who are assistants for this very famous couple who's about to go on tour, and it's going to end up being like their romance. So I was in a very heavy Christina Lauren phase at one point in my life, and I just remember pretty much enjoying this book. I can't really think about like what might have been wrong. Like I really liked it, and I have no comments. I'm sure that I would not like it if I read it now, because a bad rating probably means that I'd have a lot to critique about it today, because I'm a much pickier reader. But it's pretty awkward that I gave it 5 stars because it doesn't have a great rating overall, but that is that. Anyway, next up I have Fracture Me, which is the novella from the Shatter Me series, and that's by Tahara Mafi, and it has an average rating of 3.52, and I gave it 3 stars. And I cannot really remember which story this actually was, but basically I feel like I was pretty overall right with what I ended up rating it, because that is somewhat the average rating. So yeah, that is that. I don't have much to say because honestly can't remember what that novella was about because there were so many of them. Anyway, next up I have The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. So this is the first book in the Hazelwood series, and it has an average rating of 3.58, and I gave it 3 stars. And I read this back in August of 2022. So that I know is just about 2 years ago, because it is July of 2022. No, I read it in August of 2020. I totally messed it up. But basically that is 2 years ago that I read this book, because it is July of 2022 and that is August of 2020. So backtrack 2 years ago minus a couple of weeks. But anyway, my point is that I was pretty on point with giving this a 3 stars way back when I wasn't even picky. So pretty proud of myself on that. But basically, I liked the idea of this book. Like, this is about this girl who basically finds out that the storybook that her grandmother had written of these like dark and twisted fairy tales are actually true, and they actually all take place in this Hazelwood where her grandmother lived, and she's basically going to end up getting sucked in there, and then there's going to be a bunch of twists and turns that you probably didn't see coming. So the idea of this book was honestly amazing, and I still stand by that. The issue is the execution of it I didn't really enjoy. So that is kind of why I gave it 3 stars, because like I didn't really like how it played out. I remember being like pretty bored while I was reading it, but the idea of it was like absolutely insane to me. So that is that. Anyway, next up is The Last August, which is the second book, The Last of August, which is the second book in the Charlotte Holmes series by Brittany Cavallaro, and it has an average rating of 3.6, and I gave it 4 stars. So I read this back in August of 2020 as well, so that is about 2 years ago when I wasn't very picky. So I'm sure that even if I read it now, I would not give it 4 stars. I'd probably give it like a 2 or 3, because I remember that I really did thoroughly enjoy the first book in this series, which is what is it called? This is The Last of August. So like, I don't know, A Study in Charlotte. The first book is A Study in Charlotte, and I remember really enjoying it for what it was at the time that I read it. Like, it's basically about this these 2 kids who are in a school, and they are both the descendants of Sherlock Holmes and Watson, and they're basically going to meet, become friends, and then they're going to be basically set up as like for a mystery, like as if like, oh, people are trying to set them up like that they killed this person in this school, as if like, you know, it's one of the Charlotte like the Sherlock Holmes, like someone recreated the Sherlock Holmes, one of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and they set them up to look like they were the ones who killed them, and then they're basically gonna have to solve the mystery together and get themselves out of this murder charge of sorts. So confusing. But anyway, the first book, it was really good, but there are 4 books in this series, and every single book that I read after book 1, I ended up knocking down a star. Like every single book just got worse and worse for me. So I'm not surprised to see the 3.6 rating versus my 4-star rating. So yeah, anyway, that is that. Let's move on. Next up is The Worst Best Man by Mia Sosa, and this has an average rating of 3.60, and I gave it a 4 stars, and I read this back in March of 2021, so just over a year ago. I'm getting better at math, doing this much quicker. Anyway, I remember this being not a bad book. It wasn't my favorite at all, but I remember it being pretty solid. Like, this is basically about this girl who she was about to get married to this guy, and then the brother of the groom basically convinced the guy not to marry her, so he ended up like leaving her at the wedding, and then it's 5 years later, and they're going to end up having to work together for this project. They're both trying to like get a job at this hotel. Like, she's a wedding planner and he is like a media manager or something like that. They're going to be set up to have to make a presentation together, and so that is what's going to happen. Like, she gets set up with the brother of her ex-fiance, sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, so that's more or less the story. So very forced proximity stuff, and I remember there being a pretty solid amount of good stuff like this. Like, I remember there being like a 1-bed trope and a couple of other things, but there was something about it that I cannot remember off the top of my head that didn't work for me, and I'm sure that that is why I gave it a 4 stars. Like, it was a solid read. I'm sure that if I read it now, I'd give it more like a 3 stars, but basically at the time that I read it, it wasn't horrible. So yeah, that is that. Let's do a couple of more, because honestly, I could just keep going because this is like a lot of fun, but I gotta stop at some point. So next up, I have The Wedding Date by Jasmine Guillory, which has an average rating of 3.60, and I gave a 4 stars. And I'm gonna say right now, I definitely would have given this more like a 3 stars if I read it now, or even if like I could go back and re-rate it. Like, I just remember this being a very 3-star book for me. So the issue that I have with Jasmine Guillory actually is, I'm pretty sure I've read like either 2 or 3 of her books, and I have felt the same thing in all of them, that they're very mediocre. Like, the story is kind of there, but I never actually felt it. Like, there was something about it that never gave me sparks, and I felt the same thing for every book that I read by her. So that's why I decided to like not continue. Like, this one, I honestly can't even remember like the specific scenario. Like, I don't know, maybe, you know what, I could remember it a little bit. They met in an elevator, and he was going to a wedding of his best friend who was about to marry his ex or something like that. So he really wanted a date. They got stuck in an elevator together, and she basically like offers to go with him. They end up having a 1-night stand. They really had a great time together, and then they're gonna try to make long distance work or so. So when I say that out loud, I feel like there's a lot in that book that would not work for me now. But at the time that I read it, it was pretty okay. I just remember there being some stuff that like I was like, okay, it is what it is, but like I'm not so into it. So probably a 2 or 3 stars if I rated it today. But at the time I gave it 4 stars. I was probably being a little bit nice. But yeah, that is that. Okay. Let's do one more. This is the last one I'm gonna do because if not, I'll never stop. So the last one I'm gonna share with you is Second First Impressions by Sally Thorne. So this has an average rating of 3.6, and I gave it 2 stars, and I read this back in June of 2021. So this was the moment when I was really trying to give Sally Thorne one more shot, even though, you know, it went down. Like, first I read The Hating Game, which I really loved, then I read 99% of Me, or whatever it was called, because we went through it earlier, and that was okay. And then this one just went like downhill. So I basically like gave up on her after this one. I really didn't like this one. Like, this was one that I definitely should have DNF'd, but I didn't. Like, there were just so much off about it, and I don't even know where to start. But you're basically following this girl who is working at a nursing home, and she's gonna end up having a romance with the like grungy bad boy who happens to like own it. Like, his family owns it or something like that, and he's gonna be like working there for a little bit, and they're just gonna have like a proximity situation. And I just remember there being like so much that felt off like for me on this book. Like, first of all, the guy had long hair, and like I can forget about it if you just like tell me and then we move on, but this girl was obsessed with the fact that this guy had long hair, and honestly turned me off every time it was brought up. And then also, like, I feel like I don't remember enjoying the girl, or maybe I don't remember enjoying the boy. I don't know. Basically, there was so much about it. Basically everything about it I really didn't enjoy. So I feel like I still stand by my 2 stars because I didn't DNF it, but I should have, and that's what I usually give 2 stars for. Like, I made it through the end, but I wish that I could have given it a 1 star because my 1 star is already enough. So anyway, that that is the last one I'm going to go through. So yeah, this was pretty fun. Those are the lowest rated books that I have read from Goodreads. So that is that. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, because honestly, I had a great time making it. Like, I literally could have just made this double as long. Like, I would keep going, but yeah, I just don't like making like too long of videos, because I'm going to be the one who has to edit it and re-listen to myself talk about all of this, and I'll regret it later on. So this is me saying goodbye. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Also, subscribe to my channel if you have not already subscribed. And either way, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy reading.